Joe Biden's polling numbers are worrying Democrats. Should he run for president again, or should he drop out and let someone else run? In this week's episode, we're joined by Nate Silver to discuss the Biden re-election campaign. Nate is the founder of the election prediction site 538. He's the author of the upcoming book, On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything, and you can currently find him writing at the Silver Bulletin on Substack. And in this episode, Nate and I discuss whether or not Democrats should panic about Biden's low polling numbers. We talk about which groups Biden has seen the most worrying drops with, how he can fix it, and ultimately whether or not Biden should run for re-election. As always, thank you for listening. If you want to drop a like, a subscribe, a comment on the podcast, we always appreciate that. If you really want to show your support for the podcast, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become-a-member. Patrons and members get access to our Insider Slack. They get access to bonus episodes, Sticker of the Month Club, and many more perks. So stay connected with the podcast, with the Center for New Liberalism community, and join today. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the show. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Nate Silver. Nate, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me, Jeremiah.
So today we're talking about Joe Biden's re-election and the idea that he is really, really struggling at this point. And some people have started to talk about the need to find another candidate. Sometimes this takes the form of people actually running. They believe this strongly enough that they are running, whether you are RFK Jr. or whether you are Dean Phillips or whether you are Andrew Yang, who's cheering on anyone and everyone who challenges the two-party system, or whether you are Joe Manchin and just kind of giving little hints that you might do something. That's happening. There's also a lot of punditry taking place about this. Obviously, people are up in arms. And that's the subject of what I want to talk about today is, should Joe Biden run for re-election? Is there a case that he should not? But before we get into that, before we get into the question of should he run or not, I think we have to answer a previous question, which is, how much trouble is Joe Biden in? Because all of this comes from the fact that people are very nervous. People on the Democratic side are nervous about Joe Biden's chances. And so obviously that leads to this kind of speculation. But what position would you say, as someone who obviously has followed the polls for many years and will probably follow them until you die, what position is Joe Biden in? How would you characterize his chances right now?
I would characterize him as embattled. I mean, look, if you want to be purely rigidly empirical about it, which maybe you do, maybe you don't. I mean, it's a small sample size of recent presidential elections. Empirically, head-to-head matchups, so what is Joe Biden polling against Donald Trump, those tend not to be very predictive a year in advance of a presidential matchup. However, if you look at approval ratings and kind of derive a president standing from that, those are somewhat predictive. And right now, Biden is at a 38% approval rating. That is lower than anybody who's been reelected in the past. Now, we can speculate about whether those numbers will tend to improve or decline.
I actually have a quick question about approval rating, because this is something I've noticed, and I don't know if I've made this up in my own head, but it seems like there's kind of this secular decline over time in approval ratings, regardless of party, that since kind of George Bush, there's always been this, like, half the country is going to hate you no matter what, even if you're the greatest president of all time, Republican or Democrat, there's going to be 50% of the country who's kind of dedicated to hating you. And you've got this natural ceiling. And it seems to me like Trump had pretty low approval for most of his time, but it was also like low and steady to some extent. And Joe Biden's approval is also very low, and it seems kind of steady, like it doesn't change very much. And I'm just wondering if like approval ratings just are low, like is America kind of turning into France, where We always disapprove of the president.
Look, I think there is definitely something to that as a consequence of, on the one hand, in an extremely polarized partisan environment, then yeah, you probably do start out with roughly half the country disinclined to like you. And then, it's an environment where there's a lot of unhappiness, there's a lot of negativity. Media coverage, this isn't new, right? It bleeds, it leads, has long been kind of a staple of the media's attitude, but like things are framed negatively for the incumbent, for the status quo. You have people who are maybe more prone toward anxiety and depression than they used to be, and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of concerns, right? But you have a polarized and pessimistic country, and that probably leads to some secular decline in Joe Biden's approval. So, like, I want to preface this by saying, like, everything we're talking about, look, I think if Joe Biden is a nominee and Donald Trump is a GOP nominee, I think it's roughly a jump ball next year, 50-50. If you absolutely put a gun to my head, I might expect Biden to inch over the finish line, But I think people should, even in the context of like, yeah, it's more normal now to have a like 38, 39% approval rating. Even so, I think people should, at the very least, take the polling seriously enough to realize that we might wind up with Donald Trump as president again, right? At the very least, just whatever mental preparation you have to do for a second Trump term, like this is on the table as an outcome. We can debate exactly what the percentage is, but it's not a trivial likelihood.
Yeah, I think that some people are kind of taking the stance that, well, look, Donald Trump was really unpopular almost his entire term, and he lost the re-election and he lost the popular vote by a pretty significant margin. And he's got all these criminal troubles, and he's only gotten more scandalous over time. And January 6th happened. And so how could we possibly be losing? I think a lot of that is kind of what's happening. Like, how could this possibly be, in a sense?
Right. And look, I do think, again, I guess my baseline case is that I do think that, I mean, right now, Biden is down by like 2.5 or 3 points in the polls. If I'm saying that it's a toss up next year, I guess that implies that like his numbers will improve, I guess is kind of my modal prediction. And that's partly because Trump has kind of been out of the spotlight, oddly enough. There has been a lot of very important real world events, such as in the Middle East. There has not been a terribly exciting or competitive Republican primary. Trump has not participated in the debates, for example. In some sense, a question of will Biden be replaced is a more dramatic question, I guess. By next year, I mean, voters will get a lot of news cycles in which Trump is the lead character. They'll be reminded, based on hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising from the Biden campaign, as well as lots of kind of earned media coverage about what life was like under Trump, about how his presidency ended.
Do you think that Trump benefits from not being on cable news, not being at the debates, not being on Twitter anymore? Like that him being out of the spotlight is just beneficial for him at this point?
Well, for sure. I mean, look, yeah, if you look at Biden on his own terms, it shouldn't be that hard. Well, I don't know. Maybe someone take that back. Part of what people have to do is kind of step out of the mindset of being like a high political news consumption, college educated voter, as kind of people are on Twitter or who are reading Substacks and other kind of political blogs, right?
Anyone listening to this, basically.
Yeah, right. To a lot of voters, it's like, well, things aren't going well, right? There are all these problems, and Biden seems super old, and why didn't we even have like a primary this time, really, right? And are they really running these same two guys back again for the second time in a row, who are both deeply unpopular, right? Kind of a somewhat common sense position for like an average voter, and the groups that Biden is eroding support with are not like the high political news consumption crowd, right? It's younger voters in particular, and it's often non-white voters who didn't go to college. So, young black men, young Hispanic men, Asian voters who didn't attend college, right? These are not huge groups numerically, although young voters are, a sizable chunk, right? But like, it's not people who you're kind of seeing and hearing from day to day in kind of elite political circles. The college-educated suburbanites have become a very reliable Democratic vote and will probably remain that way, right? But that's not where Biden is hemorrhaging support.
One thing that's interesting about where he is hemorrhaging support is that it seems to be coming from all directions, supposedly. you can see that, again, some of these more moderate voters, there's concerns that Black and Hispanic voters who are normally in the Democratic camp by wide margins, that Democrats are losing their edge there. And they're probably still going to win Hispanic voters and they're still going to win Black voters, but they will have lost a good chunk. And those voters are typically a little bit more moderate. If there's such a thing as a conservative Democrat, it's often them. But you also see that among very young people, this is happening as well. And that to me looks more like young people being almost so progressive that they're angry with Biden and they disapprove and they're saying, oh, I would vote for a third party candidate or something like that. And that seems to put Biden in a pretty tricky spot in terms of, well, how do you fix this? I'm not sure that you can. If he switches his stance up on, say, I don't know, Israel, Palestine or something like that to accommodate one group, he might just piss off the other group. And the whole thing is really fascinating to watch because objectively, in some sense, Biden has been the most left-leaning president we've seen in a long time. He's accomplished like real big progressive goals. He's passed like big impactful legislation. And it still seems like young people are just furious with him. And I don't know how to square that circle as somebody who, obviously resides more on the center left. But I'm curious if you see that same dynamic.
No, I think you're right that, the New York Times, Nick Cohen had a good feature recently on who are the Democrats who are not voting for Biden. And it's not just one group. It's a combination of people who think he's too conservative and people who think he's too progressive, right? In about equal numbers, in fact. And some people who think he's fine, they just kind of aren't into it anymore. He's too old. They're tired of him, right? I think it's worth keeping in mind that if you're a young Democrat, it's been a long time since you had a candidate that you're excited about. Famously, young Democrats supported the old but very vigorous Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. This year, there's not really a competitive primary yet. We'll see if there's some last-minute Dean Phillips action or whatever, right? So you've kind of been told, if you're a 28-year-old Democrat, to hold your nose 3 times in a row because you must vote for the Democrat to defeat Donald Trump. And I think actually that pitch will work with some people, even if it's not working now. But it's a lot. It begins to be a lot to ask,
So just as a devil's advocate argument, I've heard this said that basically you should ignore young voters because, number one, they don't vote, which they do vote, say, in some degree, but they're not like, it's hard to get more young voters on the margin. And that, number two, you can't make them happy. No matter what you do, there's always going to be people on TikTok screaming about how you're doing genocide. Objectively, just no matter what you do, the certain wing of the party is always going to scream at you. And that, why make them happy if they're never going to be happy with you anyway? Is it worth trying? I mean, that seems like a dumb question. Is it worth trying to appease voters? Like, obviously, yes. But to some degree, I guess you have to pick your battles. I don't know.
Well, there is a cynical argument that, like, if they vote less and if the most likely outcome is that, okay, so cards on the table, right now, Biden is ahead by only 4 points against Trump among young voters, defined variously as 18 to 29 or 18 to 34 in different polls, right? Do I see him winning by only 4 points with that group? He won by 20 roughly 4 years ago. Probably not, right? But I could see Biden winning by 10 or 11 with lower turnout and a big third party vote.
And for reference, do you know what he won by in, say, the 2020 election?
It was roughly 20 points or 24 points or something like that, right? With voters aged 18 to 29.
So you could see when you say like he could win by 11 or 12, that would still represent a pretty significant drop. That would be a big deal.
That would be a big deal. But, but it might be like, by the way, in some of the polls that include RFK Jr. Actually outright leads among voters under age 35, right? so that goes to show
God,
kind of how much shopping around there is for alternative. Look, yeah, I think we have these kind of contradictory stereotypes almost of young voters, right? A lot of them are maybe just not that politically well informed, and a lot of them are maybe just kind of like a little bit confused and feel like Biden is not kind of helping them out of the wilderness in particular. But yeah, look, you mentioned TikTok before, and I have kind of come to believe in the past, I don't know, however long period, right? Kind of researching this, It does seem like there's maybe like a little bit more of a break point that lines up at roughly age 35, kind of a true generational shift that maybe has something to do with what media people are consuming. If you look at polling on Israel Palestine, for example, just polls that ask not a particular policy question, but like, are your sympathies more with the Israelis or with the Palestinians? There is a very sharp night and day divide at about age 35, right? Where if you're 35 or older, overwhelmingly more likely Americans are to say that they support Israel. If you're under 35, actually overwhelmingly more likely to say that you support Palestine, right? So there's something going on here. And then you see with the RFK Jr. numbers, you see on questions of like gender and sexuality, you see big nonlinear shifts. That's interesting. And on the other side of that shift, Biden just seems to have a lot of problems. How much of that could be resolved by a different Democrat, I don't think we fully know, but I do think this is kind of like a problem for Democrats going forward, right? Is that there's a disconnect or kind of like a miscommunication between the Democratic establishment, and there's no more establishment figure than Joe Biden, and these younger groups of voters who weren't really into Biden or Hillary Clinton to begin with, by the way.
Yeah, I guess that is the real question is, again, will they just come home in the end? They're unhappy, but they're just going to come home. They're going to vote Democrat anyway. That's going to happen to I feel very confident saying that will happen to some extent, but will it happen all the way, or will half of them leak out to a third party candidate, I think is the real question. You raised an interesting point there, though, in terms of Biden versus a generic Democrat. And now we kind of move into the section of, okay, well, what do we do about this? Because when you talk about, well, should Biden run or should Biden not run, you're going to have to replace him with somebody. And the polls will show like, oh, a generic Democrat is beating Trump by, 50 points or whatever. It's not 50, but it's a large number. And the problem with that, the criticism that I see about that is, well, obviously a generic Democrat or even a generic Republican will always defeat a specific instance of a Democrat or Republican because they don't have the personal problems. They haven't been slandered in the media, but there is no actual perfect candidate. You can't actually build a generic Democrat, or else Democrats would win every election. And whenever you have an actual candidate there, they're going to get picked apart. They all have some kind of weakness. Do you think that's a valid rebuttal to the whole, well, Biden shouldn't run thing, in terms of, well, Biden's just the best we've got. There is no other generic Democrat that's going to outperform him.
No, for sure. I mean, a generic Democrat is an abstract construct where maybe I like Raphael Warnock and you like AOC, right? And the third person likes Kamala Harris, and we all project our ideal candidate onto that generic label. I'd say look, the New York Times had a poll showing a generic Democrat winning by 8 points or something when they had Biden down by 4 points, and I don't think a generic Democrat would win by 8. It's a big margin in a country where both parties are pretty unpopular, right? However, the gap between the generic Democrat and Biden is like larger when that question was asked 4 years ago. If you look at other named Democrats, I think Fox News had a poll where they actually like tested Gretchen Whitmer. They actually do a little bit better than Biden on average, which doesn't sound like much, except because they have much lower name recognition, usually that hurts you, right? Half the people in the country probably don't have an impression of Gretchen Whitmer, so for her to win, or for her to like be doing a little bit less bad than the president against Trump is like not a great sign for Biden. You also, by the way, on the GOP side, have seen in higher quality polls pretty consistently that Nikki Haley does better than Trump, and she isn't even that well known necessarily, right? So look, a basic story where, again, I should go back to like priors, right? That's a nerdy word you probably hear on this podcast a lot, but like
we've got enough nerds listening here, yeah.
if the basic story is, hey, Trump and Biden are really unpopular, and so nominate somebody different, like that kind of like common sense perspective is part of what I'm trying to advocate for, I think, right? Now, in the real world, it gets a lot more messy. I guess we're going to talk about this, right?
Yeah. Well, I want to introduce an idea because you talked about kind of the Whitmer name recognition issue, and is it good or bad that she's actually outpolling Biden by a little bit, even with lesser name recognition? I think there's something that happens with name recognition where it's kind of nonlinear. If your name recognition is zero, if you are Dean Phillips effectively, or whoever, whoever the mayor of Miami is, whoever, I've actually forgotten his name already.
Suarez, yeah.
Yeah, Suarez. There's these candidates with actual like zero national name recognition, and they're going to be hurt by this. They're going to do worse in the polls. But then there's kind of this, I think your peak is actually when you've got a little bit of name recognition. People know you, but they don't actually know much about you. And I think that's where most people sit, for instance, with like Nikki Haley or Gretchen Whitmer. They're kind of aware that these people exist. But if you ask a typical voter in a swing state that's not Michigan, what do you know about Gretchen Whitmer? Or, somebody not from South Carolina, what do you know about Nikki Haley? They don't know much other than the party that they're in. And I think after that, it actually, you kind of go downhill the more you know about somebody. As Gretchen Whitmer is forced to like stand on a national stage and give a lot of complicated stances on abortion and Palestine and social security and criminal justice and what are you going to do about shoplifters and looters in my city? Like the more stances you take, at some point it starts to hurt you. There's a decline at some point with the whole name recognition and publicity thing.
No, that seems plausible to me for sure, right? And like, look, there are real divisions within the Democratic Party, particularly over the Middle East, that will be hard to navigate for any Democrat. And also, look, if you could wave a magic wand and all of a sudden Gretchen Whitmer is a nominee, then if I could fiat that, do I think I'd like her chances better than Biden? I mean, I think probably, yeah, to be honest, right? But how you get there might be pretty ugly, and you might end up with Gretchen Whitmer. You might end up with a more damaged version of Biden, right? You might end up with Kamala Harris. You might end up with someone more on the left, right? You might end up with Gavin Newsom, which we can debate, is he a better candidate than Biden or not, right? But yeah, so it's kind of like the ideal, and you also might wind up with a Gretchen Whitmer who hasn't been as battle tested as a candidate typically would be because she's entering very late. So that's why it gets complicated very quickly, I think.
The Gavin Newsom thing is interesting, just as a sidebar, because it seems like, at least my perception is that everyone just kind of assumes based on how his face looks that he's going to he must want to be president. He's going to be president. Everyone's going to vote for him. And I've never actually understood what his constituency is other than I guess California. But he seems so generic, but people were like, well, here's a tall, attractive white man in Democratic politics. And he's got a nice smile. He looks like a it must just be him. And if you look at prediction markets, he's above Kamala Harris in terms of if Biden's not going to be the guy, who's it going to be? People just kind of assume it's him. And I still am having trouble figuring out why. I don't know.
I think tactically he kind of made himself like a focal point, or like a Schelling point as a nerdy version of it, where he kind of quasi, you can argue that Gavin Newsom actually ran for the Democratic nomination this year, right? Not in the sense of officially declaring, but for with
the stunts that he did. Isn't he still doing some kind of debate with Ron DeSantis or something like that?
He's kind of running this shadow, almost vice presidential debate against the second place or maybe third place now Republican candidate. Yeah, it's been a little bit weird. And so just the fact that he kind of made it known, not terribly subtly, of course now he's rescinded everything and said he backs Biden, right? But look, I would bet against him on prediction markets, but he kind of made himself the tip of the tongue default. If you need a candidate to enter at the last minute, I am the governor of the state that would be whatever it is, the sixth largest economy in the world or whatever it would be, right? And I have been kind of running a quasi-national campaign. I think what Gavin Newsom's done tactically is actually kind of smart if you're making this hedge on, well, there is some actuarial chance that Biden will have to drop out, right?
I feel like there's a joke in here about he's tanned, rested, and ready.
There you go. No,
he's certainly tanned, but
and again, the more last minute, look, we're all adults here. Biden could have some medical episode or something like that, right? It's not a trivial probability when you get to 81 years old to survive another year without some major medical problem, right?
Well, and actually, you wrote about this, so I want to interrupt real quick just to ask a clarifying question, because I know you've kind of stated your opinion on this in a couple places, but Biden is 81, and age is obviously playing a factor here. Age is something we can't ignore. That's one of the reasons people don't seem to like him very much. And I want to get your thoughts on like why that is, exactly what's happening there. But it's also interesting that Trump is not that much younger. Trump would also be one of the oldest, the second oldest president of all time, I think, if elected, only second to Biden. So what do you think is happening there where Biden is getting pinged for his age, but Trump is not?
I think it's kind of half perception and half reality. So first of all, the effects of aging on your risk of death per year, and maybe more importantly, like the risk of like cognitive impairment. Like the risk of dementia begins to increase exponentially every year once you get into your kind of mid 70s, early 80s, right? So like 4 years, I mean, if you have like aging relatives or aging parents, like 4 years has not necessarily, it's 3.5 years really, right? That's not necessarily trivial, right? It's not crazy to be more, and Biden is, Biden is older, was older on his first day in office than any prior president had been on their last day in office. So he's a pretty big outlier. And it's not crazy to say that, like, okay, over 80, maybe that's where you just would want like an upper limit, right? At the same time, look, Trump, I guess, presents a bit more vigorously. He also has been on TV less recently, oddly enough. I think.
It's funny you say that because I will take off my neutral hat here and say, like, I am a biased observer here. I founded a think tank that tries to elect Democrats, and I obviously have a point of view here. But when I look at Trump, like, I see a lot of stuff with Trump that he's making a lot of very obvious gaffes where he'll like call Obama the president. And like, I think his mental state is also slipping. And maybe that's just me seeing what I want to see. But it's weird to me that people don't seem to be calling him, like, people almost expect, well, Trump is going to bluster and just say a bunch of weird shit. And who cares what he says? He's Trump. Whereas if Biden has a slip of the tongue, then it's more like he's punished for it.
Yeah, look, it's been a little bit weird that kind of the cable news cycles were so obsessed with showing every Trump rally 4 years ago, and now he seems not to be terribly visible. Maybe he's kind of like old news. But yeah, look, voters will get reminded of that, I think. And, I mean, look, if you go back and watch video of Trump from 20 years ago or something, right, there is a quite notable decline, right? And maybe you can say that for Biden as well. Look, I do think that like Democrats are playing a little bit of a dangerous game tactically to say, let's shed even more light on kind of the mental faculties of the candidates and their physical fitness and things like that. Like, I'm not sure tactically it's kind of like the game you want to play necessarily. It also kind of raises the question of, okay, if this guy is so old and that's a problem, why did you nominate the one candidate you have that's even older? I mean, that's where that becomes a hard question to answer. And maybe that's a more tactical consideration and more strategic than the average voter would be thinking about things. But like, if you want to make the physical fitness of the candidates like the chief issue, then why are you nominating an 81-year-old instead of having Kamala Harris run or something even, right? That's a tricky scenario, I think, for Democrats to think about. And I think they have to be careful not to like beg that question too much.
The key word there, I think, is you, because you said, why did you nominate this candidate who is even weaker on that? But it's very, the parties these days are much weaker than they used to be, right? When you say, why did you nominate? Well, it used to be that the party actually could nominate who they wanted. And, the smoke-filled room in some convention center somewhere, and the party would just agree on like who represents the party the best, who can placate all the various factions. And there was very much what do you call it? Like the party decides kind of dynamic. And I think that's really eroded a lot. And, you and I were talking about how like generic Republican versus generic Democrat, Nikki Haley versus Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom is probably the election that we would have gotten back in 1960 if we were using that same system now. But now we've kind of got a different thing. It's like, nobody actually made the choice. When you say, why did you renominate Joe Biden? Well, no individual actually could do that. The DNC doesn't really have a choice anymore, it seems like.
I mean, look, it's a funny scenario because, yeah, if you're back to the era of smoke-filled rooms, then I tend to think at the end of the day, Biden would not be nominated. Parties care a lot about winning, although he is a good coalition builder, right? He has a lot of loyalty in the party. So if it's 1960, then maybe he's not nominated. If you throw it to the voters and you had everyone say, okay, Gavin Newsom and maybe Kamala Harris and Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro and whoever else, right? I don't know if Biden wins that or not. I mean, it's a funny thing where two-thirds of Democrats roughly say they want someone else to be nominated. There is absolutely no consensus on who that would be. But if you had had everyone kind of throw their hat in the ring, I'm not sure what happens there. Instead, we kind of wind up in an in between zone where no individual Democrat who is more powerful than Dean Phillips, right, a congressman from Minnesota, no one is willing to gamble on, potentially or probably failing and having their political career ruined. No one's willing to gamble on that, right?
No one wants to rock the boat. But let me ask you this, because they're not gambling on it outright. But say and this is just, your perception. And obviously we're guessing here. But if you put it to a vote, say the 214 or whatever it is, members of the House of Representatives in Congress who are Democrats, if you put all the House Democrats to a vote and said, it's a secret ballot and you can either go with Biden or you can go with choose a candidate. We'll flip a coin between Dean Phillips, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, and Gretchen Whitmer. Just you get one of those four randomly. Would you rather have that or would you rather have Biden? Who do you think wins that vote if it's like a secret ballot?
I mean, I think if you kind of read between the lines a little bit, I think the median member of the House assumed before the midterms that Biden might not run again, right? I mean, you have this like Carolyn Maloney comment that kind of slipped out that like, oh yeah, he's not running, right? I think, and she is someone who was, I think, connected with leadership, and I think like that. No, I think if they had a choice, they would take the coin flip. I think because look, it's not like Democrats aren't concerned about Biden's poll standing. Yeah, there is like some denialism in some corners of like polling nerd Twitter, but the median tuned in Democrat, which certainly reflects members of Congress and their staffs, is like very concerned about the fact that Biden is trailing Trump, and also concerned about in a presidential year there are coattail effects, and it could mean that you lose your job too. So no, look, I think if you had a secret ballot that they would vote for the coin flip, right? Although maybe we have to specify now, like, exactly what percentage do you have candidates getting with different odds? I mean, the bundle of what if you have like AOC in there?
Yeah. Fair enough. I made that up in just a second, so I don't have any details there. But what I think is important there is that we think it's plausible that Biden would lose this vote on a secret ballot among powerful Democrats. But as you said, only Dean Phillips is actually willing to run against him. Nobody who has any sort of institutional power, any sort of name recognition is jumping in. So what's the disconnect there?
I mean, look, first of all, I will love to hear reporting or like TikTok, I guess is the term, of like how the White House convinced all these other Democrats, including Gavin Newsom, who was again kind of running for president, to stand down. I think part of what it was is that the logical window in which to run for president is just after the midterms, right? That's kind of chips on the table where you have to decide, am I going to run a full-fledged campaign or not? And that was a moment where Democrats felt like they were riding high. They had a pretty good midterm relative to both expectations and historical norms for the president's party. And I think that kind of calmed nerves a lot, right? That you're like, okay, inflation is getting tamed a bit. We just had a good midterm. Trump has 4 criminal indictments. Biden won the same matchup last time. Don't wet the bed. He'll be fine. In fact, thing we have to be worried about is if we have somebody get out of line and challenge him, that might be bad. Or if there's the wrong third party candidate running, that might be bad. So I think they did a very good job of persuading plausible alternatives not to run at the right time. Because if you listen to Dean Phillips, his story, and I assume this is true, I don't know for sure, but his narrative is like, I went around begging other people to run, and no one would. Therefore, I had to be some type of default alternative. Because he would say, I would rather have had a Midwestern Democrat, Gretchen Whitmer, whatever, run, and they all unconvinced that it would be a wise idea for them to take on Biden.
So let's move into hypothetical pundit scenario, because if there's anything we know about Nate Silver, it's that he loves pundits, and he loves when pundits just give opinions and with no backing whatsoever. But this is the second half of a podcast, and nothing you say in the second half of a podcast ever counts. I think that's a law.
Okay, perfect.
So I think that's a rule of the universe. So let's imagine you have Joe Biden's ear, and for whatever reason, he has decided to trust you unconditionally. And he's saying, all right, you've made your case, Nate. I'm listening to you. This seems to make sense. But is it too late at this point? If I actually announce now that I am not going to run for president, I've changed my mind, basically, would that help or would that hurt? At this point, right now, we are recording this in, what is it, late November 2023. Is it too late for me to drop out? Should I just forge ahead, or would it actually be beneficial even now for me, Joe Biden, to drop out?
Look, I'll say a couple of things. One is that inherently you kind of have to be a pundit here, right? There's no like empirical way to answer this question really. You have a small sample size of elections to begin with. You've never had a candidate this old before. You've never had an opponent who looked like he might win despite being so unpopular before, in the form of Donald Trump or someone under 4 criminal indictments. So you can't avoid being a pundit on this question. That's hedge number one, right? Hedge number two is, it seems to me like it's close enough that I would want information that I don't have access to as a member of the media, right? Bit of information I want, number one, is like, how capable is Biden of running a normal campaign where you're spending, 5 out of 7 nights on the road in swing states, having long days. You're also, by the way, still president of the United States. There was a Politico article from Jonathan Martin, a magazine article, so not quite reported, a little bit more opinion than usual, that came out like 2 weeks ago, roughly, where Martin kind of asserted that actually Biden can't run a normal campaign at this point, right? If that's the case, if he's not able to like go to Pennsylvania 20 times between September and November, right, and do a rally and be on television and not say things that come across as embarrassing, then I think he should step down, right? But I don't know that for sure. It was kind of like not quite a reported fact from Martin. It was like a bit of conventional wisdom kind of phrased in kind of the passive voice. I'd also want to know who else is actually interested and how ready are they on short notice. If Gretchen Whitmer is like, I've been kind of pining for this the whole time, I'd love to do it, right? And that's one thing. If they're kind of reluctant, and then maybe you end up with maybe a Newsom or or a Harris, then I don't know. But I don't think it's too late, right? It's technically not too late until Democrats have their convention. What is it, in August? And in fact, one reason why you have this whole complex system of delegates and not just a direct election, right? You have conditions under which shit changes at the last minute, and you have to make a have to make a different decision, right? So it's it being too late, I think, is a kind of convenient excuse for the White House. I mean, it would be an abortive process, right? You would have some ballot deadlines would pass in the early states. So what you're realistically talking about is that the early states are weird because some candidates are not yet on the ballot who would want to run. And what happens in practice is that, like, the big states that vote later, I haven't even looked at the calendar fully, but like the New Yorks and Californias have a lot of influence. And what it really becomes is probably no candidate gets a majority of delegates outright, but like a candidate will have a plurality of delegates and looks to build momentum between late voting states and polls, and then becomes a nominee at, drumroll, a contested convention, right? That's what we're realistically talking about. And it's not a great scenario. It's actually a pretty bad scenario for Democrats. Ordinarily, you would not want that to happen. It is quite chaotic.
Yeah, I think if this is going to happen, it's definitely got to be some sort of like Joe Biden almost anoints a successor. And I know that some wings of the party would probably scream at that, but it clearly he doesn't have problems like coordinating with people. We saw him do that with Buttigieg and Beto and Amy Klobuchar and who else, there may have been one more, but I think if you're going to do this, it's very important you do it in the right way, because it could be really badly bungled if it's not.
Well, yeah. So let's start. Look, I think on balance, if Biden decided tomorrow that he's not going to run and then takes a couple of weeks to coordinate that message, I mean, arguably it's better for Democrats. I do think it's very close, arguably, right? If someone else just ran and Biden's still running too, I'm not sure that's better for for Democrats. It's a harder case to make. Look, I don't think it's a bad idea to give voters a choice in some perfect ideal world where everyone has like 180 IQ or something, right? Maybe Democrats would want to like somehow curate a field of two or three candidates and give voters some type of choice. I don't know. I mean, like optionality is not a bad thing to like say like rush and like see who actually survives the rigors of a campaign and fundraises and wins in all these different types of states. Like it's not a bad thing to have that battle testing before you run the general election. But yeah, look, I don't think like first of all, I don't think a hand pointed successor would necessarily do all that well unless because like there's no I mean the Democrat with the second highest name recognition, I guess, is Kamala Harris, right? And we could talk about her. But a lot of Democrats think she would lose to Biden, and she's not a terrible or lose to Trump, and she's not a terribly capable candidate necessarily, right? After that, I mean, you know, you're not going to nominate.
They're coming after you on Twitter now. I can already
Uh,
hear the Kamala stands on Twitter. Just you're
there are not very many Kamala stands on Twitter, right?
yeah. Well, not anymore. It used to be a bigger group. You used to get dogpiled if you said anything bad about Kamala. But I do think that they've been beaten down over time by reality polling. I don't know. But yeah.
But look, you know, you have generational turnover, right? Hillary Clinton's not going to be nominated again, I wouldn't think. Bernie Sanders is just as old as Biden, or maybe he's a year older or something. I now forget that. You know, Elizabeth Warren is old and too far. You know, the most recognizable Democrats are none of them are particularly seem particularly electable, to put it one way, right? And with Harris, I mean, look, in the New York Times poll, she actually did better than Biden, which I think is the first poll because I looked at this, which is the first poll in like a year where that's been true, where she actually did 1 point better than Biden did against Trump, but still was losing to Trump. So the issue with her is she ran one of the least successful campaigns for the presidential nomination in a long time. I mean, there's a long list of like Scott Walker and Phil Gramm and Rick Perry and Ed Muskie back in the day, right? There's a long list of kind of failed candidates, but you know Marco Rubio probably is somewhere on that top 10 of failed candidate list, but she's in that like top 10 list of candidates who really failed to live up to advanced billing. And I think that ought to worry Democrats quite a bit. And you know her electoral track record when she won as Attorney General in 2010 in California was by a quite narrow margin relative to the blue lean of California overall. So there is like
Mm-hmm.
empirical evidence that she is not a terribly popular candidate. Maybe we should talk to more about. Look, I think if okay, second half of the podcast, so hot takes don't count. We agreed, right?
That's a law.
Yeah,
That was actually passed this year in Congress, I think.
I think if Biden had nominated somebody else as VP, Gretchen Whitmer or Val Demings or Tammy Duckworth, I forget who was on the short list, right? I think there's a good chance that that person would be the presumptive nominee right now, or not presumptive, but like that Biden would have bowed out, and that person would come in with a pretty large advantage relative to the field.
You're saying in this scenario that Biden's nominated someone else for vice president all the way back in 2000 and or, I'm sorry, in 2020. 2000 was way very long ago, although he probably ran for president then. He's run for president many, many times. But so he nominates, say, Tammy Duckworth or somebody. And in this scenario, the vice president is a popular figure, more popular than him, whereas Kamala Harris has always been kind of struggled with low ratings and low approval and over the last few years.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm sure those figures could be polarizing after 3 years in office, but yeah, look, my mental model of Biden is that he genuinely is trying to look out for the best interests of the Democratic Party, and he thought it wasn't in the best interest of the party for him to run in 2016, and he thought it was for him to do it in 2020. And like, I don't know, right? I think also probably once you make a decision and you have kind of all your staff around you, then maybe you get dug in and get like a little bit stubborn. But like, I think if Biden were convinced now that Joe, all you have to do is step down and then Democrats will beat Trump for sure with candidate X instead of it being 50-50. I think he would step down, right? I don't think he's so egotistical to not make that decision. He's always been like kind of a capital D Democratic Party loyalist. But the fact that the obvious successor would be the vice president, and even now with all Biden's problems, it's maybe a toss up whether Harris would do better than Biden or maybe she'd be a bit worse. If you look at the consensus of polls, not just New York Times poll, like that seems to be like a major factor in his decision.
All right, so we're coming up towards the end of the podcast. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask here, and that is, where should people go to learn more? If they're interested in what we're talking about, if they're interested in this kind of analysis, in kind of having smart analysis and opinions about the 2020 election, about polling, what would you recommend for people who are into that kind of stuff? I will start by saying, obviously, you should go read the Silver Bulletin on Substack. It's where you can find Nate's writing right now that he is decamped from 538. So everybody go check that out and subscribe. But beyond your own writing, which I am happy to promote, other than that, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more here?
That's a great question. Look, I do think that, I am a big fan of the Upshot and the New York Times, both the polling they're doing and the way they're kind of like thinking through and talking through these problems. Look, I think other Substacks are worthwhile. I think some of the discourse occasionally on on Twitter X is like worthwhile because this isn't purely like this is not like a time when should just look at the data people. I think sometimes the data people in fact get like a little bit too close trying to like pick apart this or that like crosstab in polls. This is kind of a difficult problem.
This is what you were writing about today, right? Like don't discount the crosstabs just because they disagree with what you say, what your preferred outcome is.
Yeah, I think people are kind of too interested in kind of, can we find a technical answer to this, right? This is a big, hard question that nobody's going to be very certain about at all, right? Look. In some ways, the most important people are reporters who can talk about kind of what is it actually like day to day inside the White House, right? Because that's what kind of shifted me from being like, it's close, so it's probably too late, to being like, oh, maybe actually should be a real thing. Is the semi-reported, semi-opinion piece from Jonathan Martin at Politico saying that Biden is not capable of running like a normal campaign. I mean, that's what I would really want to know is kind of any type of preview of what's the president like from day to day. Is this a media fixation on a guy who was doing pretty well for an 81-year-old, right? Or are there kind of problems beneath the surface and he's in some state of decline, and then you're really playing with fire as far as voter perceptions next year? I would want to know that more than what some polling crosstab says.
Well, we've got another year of this to look forward to. So, this is an ongoing question we're gonna have. I think it's unlikely at this point that Biden drops out unless he has a health scare in the very near future. It seems unlikely. But then again, maybe you can just use a health scare as an excuse if they decide that's the right thing to do. But I would expect Biden to be the nominee at this point. I think prediction markets agree with that. And, we'll just have to see how this all plays out.
The prediction market number on Biden's about 70%, right? It's a hard process because it is this kind of.
I would buy at 70%, by the way, to be the Democratic nominee.
At 70, you probably want to buy. At 80, I might be hold, right? But 70 seems a little bit low.
Yeah, well, we're going to see how it plays out, and we're all going to be watching it very closely. I don't think anybody can look away at this point. I want to say thank you one more time to my guest, Nate Silver. Nate, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.